What's up, everybody? It's your boy Ty, creator of hashtag It Is Written. My videos are to equip and encourage believers to continue to do what God has called you to do. Your boy done got a fresh haircut for the video. Man, I can't wait for my wife to see this because it changes a man, okay? And speaking of wives, this video is going to be about marriage. And the reason why I'm making this video about marriage is because of the recent events surrounding Cardi B and Offset. And also because for like the past decade, there has been this attack and this sort of devaluing of marriage and what it means. And so I just want to kind of clear the air about marriage. So although my channel is for the believers to equip and encourage them, I'm also going to be speaking to the secular community. I think it is our job as believers to influence the culture, not the other way around. Let's look at Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 1. It says, do not be conformed with the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So it's our job to influence the culture. And it seems like for this topic of marriage, the culture has really influenced us. So marriage is the oldest institution between humankind. It's also the answer to the stated fact in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, where it says, it is not good for man to be alone. Let's put some context around that. During this particular time of the creation story, Adam was put in charge of certain things in the garden, and he could not do this job alone. He could not fulfill this role. It was too big for him. So the Lord made a suitable helper for him. And Adam, out of the overjoy and praise of when he sees this beautiful woman, he says, man, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 24, kind of elaborates and says, for this very reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be united with his wife. And from this very short passage, this small chunk within Genesis chapter 2, we learn a whole bunch about marriage and what it means. And here we have God, who created this beautiful, flourishing home, wanting to move forward with that, wanting to harmony to be extended throughout his whole creation, decided that the agent for that continuation is the beautiful relationship between a man and a woman in marriage. What God could have done was made more men, right? Men have, let's just be honest, they're stronger than women. And in order for work to be done, like tilling the ground and like tending to animals, it would be nice to have some partners with you, right? Some brothers with you. But that's not what God intended. This intelligent God decided that this is what's going to carry what I want to do here further, is this relationship between this man and this woman. And that speaks volumes about marriage. Think about that. Marriage was God's design for the continuation of harmony. Marriage, the relationship between a man and woman. This is one of the reasons as to why marriage is sacred and needs to be deemed as a sacred institution. Let's go ahead and go to the other side of the cross on the New Testament side and see what the Bible has to say about marriage and why it's sacred. By the way, when I mean sacred, I mean something that's like holy and set apart. Marriage is set apart from than any other relationship that man can enter into. That's what I mean when I say sacred. I mean like holy. If you go ahead and look at Ephesians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul kind of gives us a 30,000 foot image of what marriage really is, and it's to resemble or point to the relationship of Christ and the church, or the love and the oneness that Christ and the church share. If you will, let me go ahead and point out some of the similarities between marriage and this relationship between church and the Christ. Jesus Christ is the husband, right? And the church is his bride. If you go ahead and look at the roles of husband and wives and Jesus in the church, you'll see the similarities there. You have Jesus, who is the husband, who is to sacrifice his life for the church, to protect the church, to love the church, to care for the church, to advocate for the church. And in the same manner, it's the husband's role and job to protect his wife, to sacrifice his life for his wife, to care for his wife, to love his wife, and to advocate for his wife. Now let's go ahead and look at the parallels from the church and the wife. The church is to submit to Christ, to honor Christ, to have reverence for Christ, to be devoted to Christ. In the same way, the wife is to submit to her husband, to honor her husband, to have reverence for him, and to be devoted to her husband. What we see here is if marriage is done right, then basically it points people to how Christ loves the church and the proper response to Christ's love. In other words, marriage is much bigger than the husband and the wife. Marriage points to the gospel. Marriage is the only tool explicitly stated in the Bible in which non-believers, if they want to know what it means to have fellowship and relationship with Christ as his church, they have to look to a marriage. That's why marriage is so sacred to us. And we need to start treating marriage like the sacred institution that it is. And I'm talking to you, Christians. It is the only tool explicitly stated in the Bible in which people are going to know what it means to have a relationship with Christ. And we treat it like everyone else in the world, as non-sacred, as devalued. When a culture or a society doesn't know this about marriage, or better yet, in our Western case, rejects this very fact about marriage, they use marriage for their own political, social, and economic gains. We, as Christians, must educate ourselves about what marriage is and live that Romans 12:1-2 life. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Know what marriage is and treat it like the institution that God made it to be. And with that, it's now time for some thoughts and takeaways, or what I call TNT. TNT number 1, marriage is not man-made. I know the response to marriage to the secular world. I know it. You know what they say? Well, marriage predates Christianity. Well, duh. The first people to ever be created were Adam and Eve, and they weren't Christians. I know that. But marriage is a God-ordained institution, and we need to recognize that. TNT number 2 is this: marriage is much bigger than man and woman. I'll say this: if marriage is done right, it is the greatest tool for ministry we have as believers. And finally, TNT number 3 is this: Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 1-2. Do not be conformed by the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Okay, listen here. Regardless of what the world might say about what marriage is, you need to read and study the word for yourself to know what it is. You need to treat it for what it is. Days should be long gone for Christians and non-believers to have the same divorce rate. It should be long gone. Matthew chapter 19, verse 6 tells us that, therefore, let no man separate what God has brought together. All right. And so that's all I had for y'all for this episode of Hashtag It Is Written. Like, comment, share, and I'll see y'all next week on It Is Written.